The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Meredith Langston adjusted her glasses, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently against the wooden bench. This was just another case, another face, another name she wouldn't bother remembering. She smirked, leaning back in her chair as her gaze landed on the man standing before her. Noah Carter, a black man in his late 40s, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his posture straight and confident. But none of that mattered to Judge Langston. She had already made up her mind. To her, he was just another defendant, another excuse, another waste of time. "Well, Mr. Carter," she drawled, amusement dancing in her eyes, "let me guess. This is all just a big misunderstanding. Or maybe the system is just unfair to you." A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff smirked. The young prosecutor, eager to please, hid a knowing smile. It was an old routine, Judge Langston's favorite game. Knock them down before they could even speak. But this time, something was different. Noah didn't flinch. He didn't stammer or scramble to defend himself. Instead, he stood there, calm, composed, his eyes locked onto the judge's. Unwavering, he let the laughter settle, let the silence stretch, before finally speaking. "Your Honor." His voice was steady, deliberate. "Perhaps if you actually read the case file, you'd understand. I'm not the defendant." The smirk on Langston's face wavered. The prosecutor's pen froze mid-note. The bailiff's smirk disappeared. The air in the room shifted, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. "What did you just say?" The judge's voice was sharp now, laced with confusion. Noah tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into the smallest, most controlled smile. "I'm the one who brought this case to your courtroom." Silence. Heavy. Unyielding. And then, he reached into his suit pocket. The bailiff tensed, hand hovering over his holster. The prosecutor stiffened. Even Judge Langston leaned forward, her instincts screaming at her that something was very, very wrong. And when Noah Carter pulled out a sleek leather wallet, flipping it open in one smooth motion, everything changed. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the gold badge gleamed like a dagger to the judge's world. United States Secret Service. The courtroom was no longer a stage for Judge Langston's cruel amusement. It was now the scene of her reckoning. And she knew, before this day was over, her life would never be the same. What happens next will leave you speechless. Stick around to see how this courtroom drama takes a turn no one saw coming. And if you love stories of justice and shocking twists, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Langston blinked, her fingers tightening around the edges of the case file. She had spent years mastering the art of control, commanding a room with a single glance, making defendants crumble beneath her words. But now, for the first time, she felt something unfamiliar creeping into her chest. Doubt. Her voice, once dripping with condescension, now held an edge of uncertainty. "Excuse me," she said, forcing a dry chuckle. "What kind of stunt are you trying to pull here?" Noah Carter didn't react. He simply held the badge up, letting the weight of its significance settle over the room. The gold shield reflected the sterile courtroom lights, but the words engraved on it burned deeper than any ruling Judge Langston had ever made. United States Secret Service. The prosecutor, a young woman named Claire Mitchell, swallowed hard. She had built her career in Langston's courtroom, had admired the judge's sharp wit and unwavering authority. But now, she wasn't so sure. The bailiff, a man who had stood by Langston's side for years, unconsciously took a step back, his hand still hovering near his holster. The gallery, once entertained by the judge's mockery, now sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence. Noah's gaze remained locked onto Langston's, unshaken. "You assumed I was the defendant," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "You never even checked the file." Langston's jaw tightened. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the papers in front of her, scanning the documents she had barely glanced at before. And then, her breath caught. Noah Carter wasn't the defendant. He was the plaintiff. And more than that, he was the one who had brought this case to court. Langston's pulse quickened. She wasn't used to being wrong, and she certainly wasn't used to being exposed. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure. That still doesn't explain what a Secret Service agent is doing here. Noah took his time. He adjusted his suit, his movements deliberate, before finally speaking. For the past 6 months, he said, his voice steady, I've been leading an undercover investigation into judicial corruption in this county. His eyes never left hers. And your name, Judge Langston, has come up more than once. The room turned to stone. Langston's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The arrogance, the superiority, the untouchable air she had carried for years. It all cracked in an instant. The courtroom was no longer her domain. And for the first time in her life, Meredith Langston was the one on trial. Judge Langston's fingers curled around the gavel, her grip tightening as if holding onto it could somehow restore her authority. But the weight in the room had shifted. The silent power she once commanded was slipping through her fingers like sand. The prosecutor, Claire Mitchell, stole a glance at Langston, then at Noah Carter. Her mind raced. If what he was saying was true, if this was an active investigation, then she was standing on the wrong side of history. Langston forced a laugh, sharp and brittle. This is absurd, she snapped. You expect me to believe that you, a Secret Service agent, are investigating me? On what grounds? Noah didn't blink. He reached into his suit pocket again. The tension in the courtroom spiked. The bailiff, tensed, shifting his stance, his hand now firmly on his holster. But what Noah pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a document, a single folded sheet of paper. He stepped forward, moving with the quiet confidence of a man who had already won. He placed it on the bench in front of Langston, then slowly took a step back. Langston hesitated. The paper looked official. Government letterhead. A signature at the bottom. She unfolded it with trembling hands. The moment her eyes scanned the words, her breath hitched. Department of Justice. Active federal investigation. Her name was printed in bold letters, listed among others. The charges: bribery, case fixing, collusion with private prison executives. Her stomach twisted. The prosecutor leaned forward, her face paling as she read over Langston's shoulder. The bailiff's jaw tightened, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Noah's voice broke the suffocating silence. You see, Your Honor, he said, his tone even, unwavering. We've been watching you for a long time. Langston's throat was dry. She fought to keep her voice steady. This is a mistake. Noah shook his head. No, he said, taking a step closer. The mistake was thinking no one would catch you. A thick, suffocating tension filled the room. The once invincible judge, who had ruled over so many fates, now found herself standing at the edge of a cliff with nowhere to run. And for the first time in her life, Meredith Langston felt powerless. Judge Langston's hands trembled as she gripped the damning document, her face a mask of forced composure. The air in the courtroom had thickened, charged with an energy no one could ignore. This was no longer a routine case. It was an execution, and she was the one standing before the blade. She forced a smirk, but the desperation in her eyes betrayed her. This is nothing but speculation, she scoffed, but her voice lacked its usual bite. A desperate attempt to discredit me. Noah Carter didn't react. He didn't need to. The weight of the evidence spoke for itself. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the fear in Langston's eyes deepen. Then, another voice shattered the tension. That's not true, Your Honor. The entire room turned toward the gallery. A man in his mid-50s stood up, his presence commanding, salt and pepper hair, sharp navy blue suit. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jonathan Pierce. Langston's face drained of color. Pierce stepped forward, his expression unreadable, his voice steady as he addressed the court. "We've been compiling evidence for months. Bribery, case fixing, intentional, over-sentencing in exchange for political favors." His gaze locked onto Langston. "This investigation is very real, and you, Judge Langston, are at the center of it." The gallery erupted into hushed whispers, the weight of the revelation crashing over them like a tidal wave. The prosecutor, Claire Mitchell, felt her stomach drop. This was no longer about loyalty or career ambition. This was about survival. She set her pen down, hands tightening into fists. She had built her career in this courtroom, but she wasn't going down with Langston. The bailiff shifted his stance, his radio crackling softly at his hip. For the first time, his loyalty wavered. Langston shook her head, her breath coming faster. "You can't do this," she whispered, gripping the gavel like a lifeline. "You have no proof." Pierce's response was swift and brutal. He turned to the clerk. "Would you please read the docket number for the federal filing against Judge Langston?" The clerk hesitated, then looked down at her screen. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but firm. "Case number 24 CR 1785. A collective exhale rippled through the room. The sound of inevitability. The sound of justice catching up. Langston's composure finally cracked. Her breathing was uneven, her fingers white-knuckled around the gavel. She had sentenced thousands of people from this very seat. But now, it was her turn to be judged. And there was no escape. What do you think? Have you ever seen someone in power abuse their authority, thinking they were untouchable? Drop a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. And if you want to see more shocking stories of justice being served, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The truth always finds a way. Let's make sure it gets heard. Judge Langston's fingers tightened around the gavel, her knuckles turning white. Her mind raced for a way out, an escape, a loophole. But there was none. The walls of the courtroom, once her throne, were now closing in around her. "This is outrageous," she hissed, her voice rising, laced with desperation. "A disgraceful attempt to Judge Langston." Pierce's voice cut through hers, firm and unyielding. "You are officially under federal investigation. Effective immediately, you are removed from the bench. Federal authorities will escort you from the courthouse." The words hit her like a hammer. A deep, suffocating silence fell over the room. Every eye was on her, some filled with shock, others with quiet satisfaction. The gallery, once entertained by her cruelty, now watched her unravel with bated breath. The bailiff, her trusted enforcer for years, stood rigid. His hand hovered near his radio, but he made no move to help her. The prosecutor, Claire Mitchell, who had once looked up to Langston, sat frozen, her pen forgotten on the legal pad. Even the court clerk, a woman who had worked beside her for years, refused to meet her gaze. For the first time in her career, Judge Meredith Langston was truly alone. The heavy doors of the courtroom creaked open. Two federal marshals stepped inside. Their movements were precise, methodical, like hunters closing in on wounded prey. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes and cropped brown hair, stepped forward. "Judge Langston," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Please step down." Langston's breath came in short, uneven bursts. She looked around frantically, searching for an ally, a savior, someone, anyone, who would stand up for her. But no one did. The prosecutor kept her eyes on her notes. The bailiff shifted his weight, but said nothing. Even the spectators, those who had once feared her wrath, remained seated, watching in silence. Slowly, mechanically, Langston pushed herself up from her chair. Her gavel sat abandoned on the bench, useless. She opened her mouth as if to protest, to demand respect, to claw back the authority slipping through her fingers. But nothing came out. The marshals flanked her on either side, their presence suffocating. The weight of her own actions had finally caught up to her. She had spent years ruling over others, deciding their fates with a flick of her wrist. But today, her fate had already been decided. The heavy doors slammed shut behind Judge Langston, leaving only the ghost of her presence in the courtroom. The gallery remained frozen, as if struggling to process what had just unfolded. Moments ago, she had ruled with absolute confidence, passing judgment with an iron fist. But now, she was the one being led away, stripped of the very power she had wielded so mercilessly. Noah Carter stood unmoving, his expression unreadable. He had seen this before, the moment when the powerful realized their reign was over. It never came with fireworks or dramatic outbursts, just quiet, crushing inevitability. A low hum of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some whispered in disbelief. Others nodded, as if they had always suspected but never thought they'd see justice catch up to her so publicly. A man in the back, who had come expecting his own sentencing today, sat rigid in his chair, his gaze fixed on the empty judge's bench. He had walked in believing he would leave in handcuffs. Instead, he had witnessed something few ever did. A judge held accountable. At the prosecutor's table, Claire Mitchell sat motionless, staring at her hands. She had built her career arguing cases before Langston. Now, she found herself questioning every verdict, every ruling, every life altered by the woman who had just been escorted out in disgrace. The bailiff shifted his stance, adjusting his belt. The rigid authority he had once carried felt different. Now, looser. The weight of blind loyalty had lifted. Noah exhaled slowly, then turned to Assistant U.S. Attorney Jonathan Pierce. Their eyes met, a silent exchange passing between them. Langston's fall was only the beginning. There were more names on that list, more pieces of a system built to exploit those who couldn't fight back. Pierce gave a small nod. "We'll be in touch." Noah didn't respond. He didn't need to. His job here was done, but the fight was far from over. As he adjusted his suit and walked toward the exit, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in for those left behind. This wasn't just about Langston. This was about something bigger. A door had been opened, a precedent set. And for the first time in a long time, the people in that courtroom saw justice not as a word, but as an action. Outside the courthouse, the world had already changed. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones raised, voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to capture the biggest scandal in years. A sitting judge, removed from the bench, in the middle of court. The fall of a woman who once believed she was untouchable. Judge Meredith Langston had been escorted out through a side exit, away from the chaos. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. Her reputation wasn't just stained, it was obliterated. Noah Carter stepped outside, squinting against the harsh afternoon sun. He ignored the media frenzy, the hushed whispers of bystanders who had watched history unfold. This wasn't about headlines. It never was. Jonathan Pierce caught up to him, looking exhausted yet satisfied. "We have more than enough to move forward," he said. "The evidence your team collected, it's airtight." Noah nodded, slipping his hands into his pockets. Pierce studied him for a moment before shaking his head with a dry chuckle. "I have to ask, why do this? Why go undercover? Why put yourself in the middle of all this?" Noah turned to him, the question hanging between them. He could have given a dozen answers. Because corruption festers when no one fights it. Because people like Langston believe they're above the law. Because for too long, the system had crushed the powerless while protecting those who abused it. But instead, he simply said, "Because she thought no one was watching." He let the words settle before adding, "I just made sure she was wrong." Pierce exhaled, nodding in quiet understanding. "We need more people like you." Noah didn't respond. He didn't need to. Instead, He stepped off the courthouse steps and disappeared into the city. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But today was a win. Because power unchecked is dangerous. Because for every Langston that falls, another still sits high, believing they're beyond consequence. Because justice, when done right, isn't just a verdict. It's a reckoning. What do you think? How many people in power get away with corruption simply because no one is watching? Have you ever seen injustice happen and felt powerless to stop it? Let's talk about it in the comments. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the only way to bring justice is to shine a light on the truth.